Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Publishing Summit 2023, and thank you for joining us today. As you must know by now, my name is Gauthier Chomel. I am Project Manager for the IDEA Lab. We are thrilled to have with us today Michael Menu, Lead Developer at DMARC. Michael will tell us all about advancement in the Rhodium mobile toolkits for Android and iOS. Whether you are a developer or an enthusiast, this presentation promises to deliver valuable insight and practical knowledge. But that's not all. Michael will also introduce the Rhodium Web Toolkit, a new project that brings the Rhodium reading system to the web. With functional readers for EPUB and PDF already in place, the focus will now turn to supporting comic books and audiobooks. This expansion opens up exciting possibilities for digital publishing in various formats. Before we begin, a friendly reminder that this session will be recorded, so you can revisit it later or share it with your colleagues. And as always, IDEA Lab members will receive a written synthesis of this session, ensuring that you have access to key insight even after the event. Once again, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our sponsors, the Rhodium Foundation, Glassbox, AudioBoost, and DMARC for their support in making this event possible. Let's dive into the world of Rhodium with Michael Menu.
Thank you, Gauthier, and welcome everyone to this presentation about the state of the Rhodium toolkits in 2023. So Gauthier, you did a perfect presentation, so I think I will skip straight to the meat of the presentation. But first, a couple of words about the mission statement of the Rhodium Foundation. So our mission is to foster the development of an open and modern collaborative playground for digital reading and publishing technologies. So basically, we help people build reading apps with our toolkits, but also publishers and distributors to protect, package, and also analyze their publications. So we have a lot of projects at Rhodium, but today I will be focusing on the toolkits around mostly digital reading. So we have a couple of open source toolkits on different platforms, 3 of them. The Rhodium desktop platform, which is actually developed in JavaScript and uses Electron to develop app on macOS, Windows, and Linux. And the flagship app using Rhodium Desktop is Thorium Reader, which is developed by IDEA Lab. Next, we have the mobile platforms with 2 different toolkits built with Swift and Kotlin for iOS and Android. And actually, in the past couple of years, there has been a convergence between the mobile platforms and the desktop platforms. So even though it's still the Rhodium mobile toolkit, you can now use them to build apps that run on macOS with Apple Silicon chips, and also on Windows 11, which has a compatibility layer to run Android apps. And finally, a newer addition to our toolkits is the Rhodium Web platform with 2 different toolkits, one for the backend in Go. And as we will see in this presentation, we also use this toolkit to build command line utilities. And we also have a front-end toolkit built in TypeScript. So let's zoom in to the Rhodium mobile toolkit. We worked on a lot of stuff this year, but I'd like to focus on 3 main areas: accessibility, which is very important, of course, text-to-speech, and the new Preferences API. So before we dive into the accessibility metadata, a couple of words about the Rhodium Web Publication Manifest. So this is an exchange format and a set of models that we use in the Rhodium toolkit to represent a publication and its metadata. And there are also a couple of publication formats, such as Rhodium Audiobooks and Rhodium Divina, which use directly the Rhodium Web Publication Manifest at its serialization format. But we also created a set of mappings and parsers to parse EPUB PDF publications and transform them into Rhodium Web Publication Manifest so that they can be read in the Rhodium toolkits. So accessibility, I'm sure I don't have to stress how important this is. And this is also recurring in the talks in this DPS. And it's all the more important that now we can't ignore it with the European Union Accessibility Act around the corner. So it's something that we took into account in Regium and actually evolved the specification of the Regium Web Publication Manifest to have a native way to represent those accessibility metadata. Some example of accessibility metadata, for example, the fact that the user can change the font or the style of the book, whether or not there is a table of contents in the publication, or which access modes you need to read the publication, visual, auditory, etc. So since it's native now in the Regium Web Publication Manifest, that means that we have now a way to represent the accessibility metadata directly in the LCP protected audiobooks and Divina publications. And as the OPDS2 specification is based upon the Regium Web Publication Manifest, that means that in catalogs now, we can also embed the accessibility metadata for the publication, which is of course very useful for end users, because now they can check whether or not a publication meets their accessibility needs. And also we added some mappings to convert the accessibility metadata embedded in an EPUB OPF, convert them into the Regium Web Publication Manifest format. But we went a step further and actually added some inference rules, because we realized that a lot of publications, of course, still don't have those accessibility metadata, since it's rather new. But we can still infer some of them. For example, it's very easy for us to see if an EPUB has a table of contents. So we can deduce that the table of contents accessibility metadata can be inferred. Other example, we can check whether or not an EPUB references images. And if it's the case, then we know that visual access mode is required to read the publication, all the content of the publication. So all of this is quite technical. It's inspired by the EPUB spec, and it's not super user friendly. So next, we will probably add some helpers to help interpret the metadata, because an end user cares more about questions like, can I play an ebook, for example, with TTS, with media overlays, or can I resize the text? So this is the kind of helpers that we would want to add and encourage people to show in their apps. And next, so far the inference we have with EPUB is at the level of the OPF, but we want to go further and allow resource deep inference to check the actual content of the book. And this way we can know a bit better if certain access modes are required. Next is the text-to-speech. So it's a feature that we already had in Regium before, but we actually revamped it as a proper navigator now. So a navigator is a component that you can use to render a publication. And we realized that text-to-speech is just one kind of rendition for a publication. For example, if you have an EPUB, and you can use the EPUB navigator, of course, to render the content of the book. But if you start the TTS is just a rendition. It's an audio rendition of the same book using the text, the utterances that are extracted from the book. So we realized that we could use the same API to navigate for publication with TTS as well. And TTS is just, at its core, audio clips that are played in sequence. So it's pretty similar to an audiobook or a media overlay. That's why we have a shared API with those navigators. And the cool thing about that is that you can reuse your user interface elements, the playback controls between those navigators, and even some logic pertaining to the playback. Something else that is new for TTS is, especially on Android, is that now we support background playback. and also the media controls in the media style notifications. So that means that a user can just hide the app, lock their device, and still continue listening to the publication on the go, for example. And they can control the playback from their lock screen, thanks to the notification. Finally, for the mobile toolkit, we also worked on a new preferences API. Why did we work on that? First, we have several components that offer dynamic settings that the end users want to manipulate during the runtime. For example, the font size or the zoom. So far, every component, mostly navigators, had their own ad hoc API to manipulate those settings. And some of those API, for example, in EPUB, were actually internals that were leaking in the API. For example, to change the EPUB settings, you had to know some of the concept from Regeum CSS, because we had a 1-1 mapping between the EPUB settings and the Regeum CSS ones. So instead, we try to achieve a more cohesive API across the different navigators and components, which again allows you to reuse the user interface and the logic around the user preferences. And finally, another big reason to have this is the rules and the dependencies, conditions that are between the settings can be really complex, and especially with EPUB. And before, it's stuff that you had to hard code in the app, which is not great, because if those conditions change, then you would have to modify your app to reflect them. So I added a couple of examples. For example, the line height has a default value of 1.2, which is not obvious at all, and it might actually change. And also the hyphenation preference is actually automatically enabled when the user chooses a justified text alignment. And if you don't know this, or if you don't hard code this, you can't represent it in the user interface. So now with this API, you can do that. So what does it look like? At its core, it's quite simple, actually. Every configurable component offers a particular preferences structure, which is just a bag of data. For example, the value for the font size, the theme, whether or not hyphenation is enabled. And each of those preferences structure is serializable, so that you can store it in your database, for example, or your user default store. From there, we added also the concept of preferences editor, which is some kind of helper component, which will help you to modify the preferences structure, taking into account all the constraints and the rules that I talked about in the previous slide. So for example, the EPUB preferences editor offers a font size property, which is of type range preference, so that you know that it's actually a number that is constrained in a range. And this range preference offers a lot of different helpers to modify this value. In the next slide, I'll show you some example. And this is actually showcasing how you can reuse your user interface for those various type of preference. So the first one is the scroll setting. We can represent it as a toggle, it's on or off. And in the preferences editor, it's represented as a preference of Boolean. And a preference of Boolean in the Regeum API can be toggled, so it's a helper to change its value. Next example for the page margins, it's actually a value constrained in a range. So you can get the whole range that is supported with supported range. And you can also call the increment and decrement API helpers to change the value. And it will actually use the strategy that is embedded in the editor to know how much to increment for this setting. knowing that you can still change the progression strategy in your app if you want to have a different approach for changing this value. And finally, we also have a format helper so that you can represent the value in your user interface. So here it's not very obvious because it's just 2.8 with a comma, because this is how it's represented, but it's more interesting, for example, if you have units behind, such as the font size, which could be in points, or if you have a percentage, sorry. So it would be with a % sign. And the third example is an enum preference. So here for the theme, so it's a preference which has a fixed set of values, and you can get the list of values with supported values. On this screen, you can also see that some of the settings are grayed out. It's because we know that they can't be active under certain conditions. And this is also something that is offered by this API. I will show an example afterwards. Actually, I think it's right now. Yeah. So it's a quick demo about those new user preferences and an overview of all of them in EPUB. EPUB referable. So 3 new settings that we have related to the language and the way the text flows: language, reading progression, vertical text. Reading progression determines the direction of the text and the pages. So here you can see the text become right aligned and the pages flow from the right to the left. Vertical text is not very useful for Latin languages, but it's useful for East Asian languages when they are represented in their traditional form. And both the reading progression and the vertical text can be inferred from the chosen language. So for example, if I chose the Japanese language, by default, if you choose a reading progression of LTR, it's just displayed as English. But if you choose RTL, then it will be inferred as vertical text. And always the user can still choose to override those settings if the inference is not sufficient. Another example, if you choose an Arabic language, then you have a reading progression from right to left. Next setting, we have the scroll. So then the book is not paginated anymore, and you can scroll vertically through the resource. It's something that we had before. The columns determine whether or not we display two columns per spreads. And we can also change the page margins. Another setting, the theme, and here we can see that some of the settings are grayed out, especially image filter, because image filter is only available if you choose the dark theme, and you can get this information from the API without hard coding it in your app. So here, image filter is a new setting, and you can see that it changes the images in the book so that it's maybe nicer to read at night. The user can also choose their own colors to have a fully custom theme. So all these settings are related to the appearance. Next, we have font-related settings. The typeface, of course, we still have all the typeface that are useful for accessibility. But you can also add, and that's new in this version, your own custom fonts without forking the project. So here we added Literata in a test app. And the font size, nothing new. Font weight is a new setting though. It allows you to change the boldness of the text, which can be very useful for accessibility. And Literata is a variable font. So that means that we can really finely tune the font weight. That's why every step of the font weight setting is changing the boldness. Text normalization is also new, and it's basically overriding the fixed font style in the book. so that font weight always has an impact. Then we have more advanced settings that you get access to when you disable the publisher styles. And those are also useful for accessibility. For example, we have the text alignment, and notice that when I choose this justify, the hyphens will be enabled implicitly. As I explained before, it's Medium CSS enable the hyphens when it's justified by default. But you can always, as an end user, override this setting. And then we have a series of different settings related to the scaling of the fonts or the spacing between words, letter, paragraph, etc. And when in the interface it's grayed out, it means that the default value is used. So as soon as the user changes this value, then we can see it's actually effective. So what's new here, we have type scale, paragraph indent, hyphenation, and ligatures that were not available before. Ligatures is only available for right-to-left languages, such as Arabic. So that was all for the new stuff with Medium Mobile. What can we look forward to in the coming year? First, Medium 3.0. So the past couple of years, we did a lot of work on the APIs and changed a lot of stuff, deprecated some of the former APIs. And so we have a lot of stuff to support at the moment. So we would like to get rid of the deprecated API to get a clean slate and from then move forward. So Medium 3.0, it's coming probably this summer. Then we would like to add the support for media overlays in EPUB, but actually not only for EPUB, because we've been working on a guided navigation specification that can be used for media overlays, but also for region-based navigation in comic books and stuff. If you're interested in this, I suggest you rewatch the guided navigation presentation by Adrien Garder. Next feature you can expect is an improved support for screen readers, always for improving the accessibility, because if we have accessibility metadata, but we can't read the book with screen readers, it's maybe not super useful. And finally, streaming of LCP packages. So, for example, you have LCP protected audiobooks, which can be really large, like several gigabytes. It's not super convenient on a mobile device. And so we added the support for streaming those audiobooks from the web while still having them protected by LCP. And so it was mainly made for the LCP protected audiobook, but it can work with any zip container. And that means you could also potentially stream EPUBs from the web, even though it's not the core need for this. So let's move on to the Medium Web Toolkit now, which it's still in early development, but we have been using it in production now, and it's very promising, and people are quite happy with it. So yeah, like I said, we have two toolkits for the Medium Web, one for the backend and command line tools, the Go one, and TypeScript for the front end. Let's start with the Go toolkit. So this year we added the position list, which is a list of discrete and fixed location in a publication. For example, with a PDF, it's easy, it will be the pages. But for EPUB, we are using a strategy to split a resource in a certain amount of bytes. And we call this a position list and not page numbers, because we noticed that when people use page number, they assume that it matches the screen pages. But this is not the case here. You can have several positions or several screen pages for a position. Next, we also added a basic PDF parser to convert a PDF to Readium Web Publication Manifest with some metadata parsing. We also added the same metadata, accessibility metadata inference that I talked in the Readium Mobile Toolkit. And finally, we added a new RWP CLI tools, so command line utility. And this one is quite interesting because this goes beyond just a reading toolkit, because you can use this on the distributor side to generate new Readium Web Publication Manifest, but also extract information from your existing publications. And later on, we will be able, with this tool, to package a publication, Readium audiobooks or Readium Divina, for example. What's new in the TypeScript toolkit? So on the front-end side of things, we have now the support for fixed layout EPUB. Before we only had reflowable. And with transition, I will demo it afterwards. And it's actually a building block for the future Divina, so comic book, bande dessinée, manga navigator, especially regarding to the transition, the preloading of resources and stuff like that. We also have some ongoing work, a PDF navigator based on PDF.js, and also text-to-speech with the content iterator API, which allows you to extract the content semantically of the publication. For example, you can get in sequence the headings, the paragraph, images, etc. And here's a demo of the fixed layout web reader. So you can see that we have transitions. We can also control it with the keyboard. Some settings, we can choose to display one page or 2 pages. We can change the theme. Of course, since it's a fixed layout, you can zoom in the page. And when it's zoomed in, you can scroll through it, and then if you pull to the next page, you can go to the next resource. Next demo is the PDF navigator. So it's not yet available, but you can see that it's working quite well, and this will be added soon to the toolkit. So it's based on Mozilla PDF.js with an adapter to make it compatible with the Readium Navigator's API. So we have support for regular pagination, as you can see. And you can choose different fits for the pagination. If I fit by width, then I can scroll through the content. And then when I move to the next page, it's still fitted in. In the settings, we can choose to display 2 pages side by side. And notice that the first page is displayed on its own. It's something that you can disable. Then we also have the theme to change the background color. And as expected for PDF reader, you can also have a scrolling experience, in which case by default, it will be fitted on the width, which is more convenient when you are scrolling through the whole document. But you can choose whichever fit you prefer, and even zoom to a precise zooming scale. So what's coming next for Readium Web? So at the moment, we know that we are lacking a lot in terms of documentation. There are barely any, and we don't have a test app to showcase all of those new API and components. So it will be a major priority for the coming year. Next, we also want to implement the Preferences API that I talked about for the mobile toolkit in Readium Web as well. Media overlays, guided navigation too. We will work also on a search API on the Go backend. And this one is pretty interesting because I will talk about it later, but it's not only for the Readium Web toolkit. You could actually use this search API on the mobile toolkit when you are streaming a publication from the Go backend. And finally, we also want to work on Divina publication, so comics, bande dessinée, manga, webtoons, etc. So that was all for the new stuff regarding the toolkits. And now I'd like to talk a bit about some guiding principles for the work that we do. So first, you can see Readium as a set of components that you can combine together. So Readium initially is just an architecture. We have the streamer, the navigators, etc. And then we also have a collection of open source toolkits. And those toolkits can be used as building blocks that you can combine together. Like I gave an example before, but the Go backend can be used to stream publication to the TypeScript toolkit, but also to the mobile toolkits, in which case they can also use the web service API, for example, to run a full text search from the Go backend, or for example, even to play TTS in the background. So what this means is that platforms, mobile, desktop, web, can actually rely on multiple toolkits and not only the toolkits that are part of the project. Next guiding principle that we want to work on is to improve the collaboration around the Readium toolkits and Readium in general. And this is something that I talked in the mission statement, but we really want to foster a collaborative platform with Readium. So to improve the collaboration and encourage contribution, we're actually working on an easier onboarding for developers and integrators by writing high-level user guides, but also lower-level API specifications. We're also striving to align the APIs across the toolkits because, like I said, you can use several toolkits in a single platform. So if you learn a toolkit on one platform, you want to reuse this knowledge that you acquired across the different platforms. Also, historically, people were forking Readium a lot because Readium is quite complex. And if you want to add some custom features, usually you would need to fork it to modify it. But the problem is that when you fork, it becomes complicated to upgrade the toolkit. And it's also harder to contribute to the current state of the toolkit. So we are doing everything to help you not fork it by adding a lot of extensions points in the toolkit so that you can add your custom features. Recent example is the support for custom fonts in the hyper-referable settings APIs. And finally, I'd like to mention an example of such a collaboration that we want to foster. We've been working with Anansi, which is an initiative around improving the state of the comic book metadata. And if everything goes forth with them, the Readium Web Publication Manifest might actually become a cornerstone of the comic metadata. So this is pretty exciting, and we are very happy to work with them. Finally, just to mention that Readium is not only for reading, especially now that we have the RWP utility. So first of all, of course, we have Readium LCP that helps distributors and publishers protect their publication. This is nothing new. This is working in production for years now. Pretty exciting. Like I mentioned with RWP, distributors and publishers can actually use it to extract and infer information from their publications, such as the accessibility and the metadata that is embedded in the publication, which is interesting because with the European Accessibility Act, distributor will need to know to what extent their publications are accessible or not, and what's missing and where it's missing. So this would be helpful for this effort. We can also infer stuff like whether or not a publication has a table of contents, indexes, page lists, landmarks, etc. We can calculate arbitrary page numbers thanks to the position list that I mentioned before. And finally, so it's not yet done, but we want to allow publisher to analyze the actual publication content through the content iterator API so that they can infer some information from it. Something that is not yet available on the Readium web publication CLI tool is the packaging of audiobooks and Divina, but it's something that we also want to work on so that Readium can be used for distributor to create their own audiobooks and comics. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Many thanks, Michael, for this very clear presentation. It's very terrific to see how Readium toolkits address open issues in the ecosystem today. Very exciting. I see 2 questions, actually. So the first one is it possible to create different user profiles and save them so we don't have to change all the options every time?
Yeah, actually, you can do that. So as I said, the navigator take a simple preferences structure. And from there, you can actually create your own set of presets and create, generate this preferences structure as you want. And actually, you can even source the preferences from different stores. So it's pretty flexible, yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you. Next one is, can we organize a project to speed up the development of the web reader so it could be used in project like a library implementation? The question is from Ted van der Tugt from the KB, the National Library of the Netherlands. Is wishing an indication of hours and money to help to find grant financial supports.
So it's not really my area, so I wouldn't know what to answer to that. But I encourage you to reach out to EDIA Lab if you want to know this and maybe help with the project.
Yes, thank you. And next question, are there any plans to use the mobile toolkit to make it publicly available Readium mobile application, or is this the idea that developer must use these Lego blocks to build their own reading application?
So as far as I know, there are no plans to build an official Readium mobile app. We used to have one in the app stores, but it was pretty technical and people were using it as their own reader. And so we didn't really want to support an actual end user experience from the project. However, maybe, for example, you take Thorium Reader, which is definitely end user app, which is based on Readium desktop. Maybe something like this we'll see the day one day for mobile as well. But as far as I know, there's no plan to do this right now.
Yes, and I may add that this go back to the resource questions. That means there's no plan actually with the resources available in the Rhodium Foundation, but if anyone wants to do that, will be very welcome to participate. So I think we answered every question. To our attendees, it's the last chance to ask a question to Michael. No, it seems that we've responded all interrogations. So thanks again, Michael. Do you want to give a last word to our audience before we close this webinar?
Well, thank you for listening and also for asking some questions. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have more questions. I'm on Slack, on the Rhodium Slack. And of course, we're always available on GitHub. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.